The old colonel died with a rattle in his throat and a secret he couldn't quite spit out. His son, Bento, didn't even wait for the body to go cold before he started carving up the inheritance like a vulture at a carcass. He thought he was being clever when he kicked the most loyal worker on the plantation into a rotting wood cabin sinking into the salt marshes of the Jaguaripe River. But what Bento didn't know was that his father's last gift wasn't a death sentence. It was a trap, and the fuse was already lit. The air at the Oitero mill usually smelled of burnt sugar and sweat, but that morning it smelled like rain and betrayal. Samuel stood by the heavy oak doors of the main house, his hands calloused from 40 years of shaping timber into wealth for a family that didn't even know his last name. He had built the very stairs Bento was now descending. He had carved the intricate patterns on the bed where the old colonel had just breathed his last. Samuel was a master carpenter, a man who understood the language of wood, how it breathes, how it hides its knots, and how it eventually rots from the inside out. He expected his freedom. The old man had promised it 1,000 times in the quiet of the workshop. Instead, Bento stood there, his face flushed with a mixture of cheap brandy and new power. He held a single piece of paper in his hand, the manumission papers Samuel had waited a lifetime to see. Without a word, Bento walked to the stone hearth, watched the flames for a second, and tossed the document into the fire. He didn't even look Samuel in the eye. He just watched the edges of the paper curl and blacken until the promise of a free life was nothing but ash floating up the chimney. "My father was soft in the head at the end," Bento said, his voice dry and sharp. "He thought he owed you something. I know better. You've lived off this land long enough, Samuel. Now you're going to the marsh. There's a cabin by the river. It's yours. Consider it a reward for your long service." The other workers stayed silent, their eyes fixed on the dirt. They knew that cabin. It was a grave for the sick, a place where the plantation sent people they didn't want to feed anymore, a place where the humidity ate your lungs and the rising tide eventually claimed the floorboards. It was a death sentence wrapped in a joke. Bento laughed then, a short, ugly sound, and threw a rusted set of keys into the mud at Samuel's feet. He was certain he had cheated the old man out of every penny of his labor. He was certain Samuel would be dead within a month, swallowed by the marsh and the fever. Notice this. Some people call this tradition or the way of the world, but it's just cold-blooded theft with a prestigious family name attached to the deed. Samuel didn't argue, he didn't beg. He knew the look in Bento's eyes. It was the look of a man who was drowning in debt and looking for someone to push underwater just to stay afloat for another hour. Bento was desperate. The Oitero mill was failing, the crops were thin, and the creditors from the city were starting to circle like sharks. Samuel picked up the keys from the mud. They were heavy and coated in a thick layer of orange rust. He felt the weight of them and realized one of the keys didn't look like the others. It was small iron and had a strange double-notched head. As Samuel walked away from the main house, carrying nothing but a small bag of tools and a lifetime of resentment, he passed the kitchen. Donna Zephyr was standing in the shadows of the doorway, her apron stained with flour and her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't hide. She had been the one who brought the old colonel his medicine every night. She had been there when the old man's heart finally gave out. As Samuel passed, she leaned in close, her breath smelling of bitter herbs. "He didn't just die, Samuel," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind in the cane fields. "The medicine, it changed color." Bento was in the room. He didn't call for the doctor until the breathing stopped. "Watch the floorboards, old man. The dead don't leave without a word." Samuel didn't respond, but he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp river air. He kept walking, past the stables where young Tiao was grooming the horses. The boy looked up, his eyes full of pity, but Samuel kept his head down. He followed the narrow, muddy path that led away from the grandeur of the plantation house and down into the thick, suffocating greenery of the salt marshes. The shack was worse than he remembered. It sat on crooked stilts, leaning precariously over the dark, slow-moving water of the Jaguaripe. The wood was grey and swollen with salt. The roof was a patchwork of rotting thatch and rusted tin. When Samuel stepped onto the porch, the wood groaned under his weight, like a living thing in pain. This was where Bento expected him to rot. This was the inheritance for 40 years of building a kingdom for another man. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and old decay. There was a single room, a broken chair, and a table that had lost one of its legs. But Samuel was a carpenter. He didn't see a ruin. He saw a structure. And he noticed something immediately. The house was leaning to the left, but the central support beam, a massive piece of ironwood, was perfectly straight. It didn't make sense. If the ground was sinking, the beam should have shifted. He knelt on the floor, his knees cracking. The wood here was different. While the rest of the shack was cheap pine and mangrove wood, the boards in the center were solid cedar. They had been treated with oil, protected from the rot that was eating the rest of the house. Samuel ran his fingers over the grain. He felt a slight gap, a seam that shouldn't be there. It was then that he remembered the colonel's last words to him, whispered 2 days before the end when Bento was out in the fields. The old man had grabbed Samuel's wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been in those thin arms. "The salt meets the wood, Samuel," he had wheezed. "Look where the salt meets the wood. Don't let him burn it all." At the time, Samuel thought it was just the delirium of a dying man. Now, looking at the oiled cedar boards in the middle of a rotting marsh shack, he realized the colonel had been planning his final move long before Bento ever reached for the medicine bottle. Samuel reached into his tool bag and pulled out a small pry bar. He worked slowly, carefully. He didn't want to splinter the wood. He could hear the sounds of the plantation in the distance, the crack of a whip, the shouting of the overseers, the rhythmic thud of the mill's hammer. It was a world he was no longer a part of, yet he was still bound to it by every fiber of his being. As the first board came loose, a puff of dry, dusty air escaped from the darkness beneath. It didn't smell like the marsh. It smelled like old paper and beeswax. Samuel pulled the board away, then another. Beneath the floor, resting on a stone plinth that had been buried deep into the mud to keep it level, sat a heavy iron box. It was locked with a mechanism that looked far too complex for a simple plantation chest. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. He took the rusted keys Bento had thrown in the mud. He tried the large ones first, but none of them fit. Then he took the small double-notched iron key. It slid into the lock like it was coming home. With a heavy clack, the mechanism turned. He lifted the lid. He expected gold. He expected the clink of coins that could buy his passage to the city, maybe even buy back his freedom from a corrupt magistrate. But there was no gold in the box. Instead, there was a waterproof leather pouch tied tightly with a silk cord, and next to it lay a rusted iron branding tool. Samuel picked up the branding iron. It was a double S mark. He knew it well. It was the mark the colonel used for his most private property, his most secret documents. But there was something strange about this one. The edges were sharp, unused. It wasn't meant for cattle or for marking the crates of sugar heading to the port. He opened the leather pouch. Inside, he found a thick ledger, its pages yellowed but dry. He flipped through the first few pages and felt the world tilt on its axis. This wasn't a record of the plantation's profits. It was a record of Bento's sins. There were lists of debts, massive sums of money owed to men in the capital, debts that Bento had hidden from his father. But as he turned the pages, the entries got darker. There was a name written in bold ink, Manuel Silva, a Portuguese merchant who had disappeared 5 years ago. The official story was that he had been lost at sea on a return trip to Lisbon, but here, in the colonel's own hand, was the truth. Silva hadn't gone to sea. He had come to the Oitero mill to collect a debt from Bento. Samuel's eyes scanned the lines, his breath hitching in his throat. The colonel had found out. He had found out that his son had murdered the merchant to clear the debt and had buried the body under the old stone bridge at the edge of the property. The deed to the land Samuel was standing on, the very land Bento claimed to own, wasn't Bento's. It had been signed over to Silva as collateral for the debt. The gift of the shack wasn't just a place for Samuel to die. It was a fortress. The old colonel had hidden the proof of his son's crimes in the one place he knew Bento would never step foot, the place he considered beneath him. Suddenly, the floorboard behind Samuel creaked. He froze, his hand tightening around the heavy iron branding tool. The sound of the marsh was loud, the croaking of frogs, the rustle of the reeds. But beneath it all, there was the unmistakable sound of breathing. Someone was standing in the doorway watching him. Samuel didn't turn around immediately. He tucked the leather pouch into his tunic and gripped the iron tool like a weapon. He was an old man, but his arms were still made of the same hard wood he had spent his life carving. "I thought you'd be digging a grave by now, not prying up the floor," a voice said. It was Tiao, the stable boy. He was leaning against the doorframe, his face pale and his eyes darting toward the hole in the floor. He looked terrified, but it wasn't Samuel he was afraid of. "You need to hide that, Samuel," Tiao whispered, stepping into the dim light of the shack. "Bento's coming. He's not waiting for the fever to take you. He sent the overseer and 3 men with torches. They're coming to burn this place down. They want to build a new pier here, they say. But I heard them talking in the stables. Bento's afraid. He's afraid my father left something behind." Samuel looked at the boy, then at the hole in the floor. The trap was set, but the hunters were already closing in. The truth was in his hands, but if he stayed, it would burn with him. The Jaguaripe River was dark and deep, and the tide was starting to come in. He had a choice: stay and fight for a truth that might kill him, or run into the marsh and hope the mud didn't swallow him first. "The bridge, Tiao," Samuel said, his voice low and steady. "Is the old stone bridge still guarded?" The boy shook his head. "No one goes there at night. They say it's haunted." Samuel nodded. He knew why they said it was haunted. He knew whose ghost was supposedly wandering the stones. He looked at the iron branding tool in his hand, the double S. It was the key to everything. "Go back, Tiao. Don't let them see you here. If they ask, I was already gone when you arrived." The boy didn't need to be told twice. He vanished into the shadows of the tall grass. Samuel stood alone in the rotting shack, the weight of the secret pressing down on him. In the distance he saw the first flicker of torchlight moving through the cane fields. Bento wasn't just coming to take his life, he was coming to erase the evidence of his own damnation. But what Bento didn't realize was that a carpenter knows how to build things to last, and he also knows exactly where to hit a structure to make the whole thing come crashing down. Samuel stepped off the porch and into the cold, waist-deep water of the marsh. He didn't head for the woods. He headed for the river, the leather pouch pressed against his chest. The hunt had begun, and the man who thought he owned the valley was about to find out that the dirt beneath his feet was already screaming for justice. Samuel disappeared into the reeds just as the first torch hit the thatch roof of the shack. The fire flared up, a bright orange signal in the dark, but the secret was already moving through the water, cold and silent as a grave. The heat from the burning shack hit Samuel's back like a physical blow, even as the freezing water of the Jaguaripe River climbed up to his chest. He didn't look back. If he did, he would see 40 years of his life turning into grey ash and orange sparks. The wood he had scavenged, the roof he had patched, the floorboards that had held the Colonel's deepest secrets. It was all being swallowed by the fire Bento had ordered. Look at this. Some people call this a master's right, but it's just cruelty with a fancy name and a last name to match. Samuel moved through the thick black mud of the marsh. Every step was a battle. The riverbed was a graveyard of sunken branches and sharp oyster shells that sliced through his calloused feet. He could hear the shouting now. Galdino, the overseer, was barking orders. Galdino was a man who enjoyed the whip more than the harvest, a man who had been Bento's shadow since they were boys. "Find him!" Galdino roared, his voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. He couldn't have gone far. "Look in the reeds. If he's in the water, wait for the tide to bring his body back." Samuel pressed himself against a cluster of thick mangrove roots. The salt water stung the fresh cuts on his legs, but he didn't make a sound. He reached inside his tunic and felt the leather pouch. It was heavy. It was cold. It felt like holding a dead man's hand. He knew what was inside wasn't just paper. It was the weight of a murder. It was the proof that the very ground the Oitero mill sat on was stolen through blood and silence. The problem was that Bento wasn't just greedy, he was cornered. A cornered man with a name to protect is more dangerous than a starving wolf. Samuel knew that if he was caught with this pouch, he wouldn't just be killed, he would be erased. As he crouched in the dark, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the sugar mill in the distance seemed to sync with his own heartbeat. He closed his eyes for a second, the image of the old colonel's face flashing in his mind. The old man hadn't been a saint, but he had a code. He had kept that ledger for a reason. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was a final, bitter way to punish the son he knew was a failure. The salt meets the wood, Samuel whispered to himself, his teeth chattering. He realized then that the double S branding iron he had tucked into his belt wasn't just a mark of ownership. It was a match. The leather pouch had a wax seal on the flap, a thick, dark red disc of wax, and on that wax was the same double S pattern. If Samuel could get this to the city, to someone who wasn't on Bento's payroll, the seal would prove the documents were authentic. It would prove the colonel himself had verified the truth before he died. But the city was miles away, and the only road was guarded by Bento's men. Suddenly a new sound cut through the noise of the fire and the wind. It was a low, guttural baying. The hounds. Bento had released the tracking dogs. These weren't the lazy curs that slept under the porch. These were lean, hungry animals trained to hunt down anyone who tried to escape the Oitero fields. Samuel felt a jolt of pure, visceral terror. He knew the marsh could hide his scent for a while, but the tide was rising. Soon the water would be too deep to stand in, and he would be forced back toward the dry land where the dogs were waiting. He looked at the pouch. He couldn't keep it on him. If the dogs got to him, the papers would be torn to shreds or lost in the mud during the struggle. He needed to hide it again, but not under a floorboard this time. He needed somewhere the fire couldn't reach and the dogs wouldn't look. He looked toward the old stone bridge, barely visible in the moonlight. It was a massive, crumbling structure built by the Portuguese 100 years ago. It was where the merchant Manuel Silva was supposedly buried. No one went near it. The workers said the water around the bridge tasted like copper, like blood. The dogs were getting closer. He could hear their paws splashing in the shallows just a few hundred yards away. Galdino was laughing now, encouraging the beasts. Samuel took a deep breath and dived under the surface of the murky water. He swam, his lungs screaming for air, until his fingers touched the cold, slimy stone of the bridge's foundation. He felt around frantically until he found a loose stone, worn away by decades of current. He shoved the leather pouch deep into the cavity behind the stone and wedged it tight. He kept the double S branding iron. He needed that. It was his only weapon, his only shield. When he surfaced, he was gasping, his vision blurring. He pulled himself up onto a low-hanging branch of a willow tree, dragging his shivering body out of the water. He was exhausted, bleeding, and alone. But as he looked back at the glowing ruins of his shack, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope. It was a cold, hard desire for a reckoning. But then, the reeds directly in front of him parted. A pair of yellow eyes reflected the distant firelight. The lead hound had found him. It didn't bark, it didn't growl, it just bared its teeth and coiled its muscles to spring. Samuel gripped the iron branding tool, the rusted metal biting into his palm. He knew he couldn't outrun the dog, and he couldn't outrun the men following it. The secret was hidden in the bridge, but the man holding the key was about to be torn apart. "Come on then," Samuel hissed, his voice cracking. "Let's see if you can chew through iron." Just as the dog leaped, a sharp whistle echoed through the marsh. The animal froze mid-air, landing awkwardly in the mud. It whimpered and backed away, its ears flattened against its head. Samuel looked up. A figure was standing on the bank, silhouetted by the moon. It wasn't Galdino. It was someone smaller, someone who shouldn't have been out there in the middle of a hunt. It was Donna Zephyr. And she wasn't alone. Behind her, the shadows of the forest seemed to move, as if the very trees were stepping forward to claim the night. "The magistrate's carriage has just passed the gate, Samuel," she said, her voice steady and cold. "Bento thinks he's hosting a party. He doesn't know the guest of honor has already arrived, and he's looking for a reason to hang a man." But the relief was short-lived. From the direction of the bridge, a loud metallic clink rang out. The stone Samuel had moved had fallen into the river, and the leather pouch was now floating toward the open sea. The black water of the jaguar ripe didn't care about secrets. It only cared about the pull of the moon and the weight of the salt. Samuel watched, paralyzed for a heartbeat, as the leather pouch containing the truth about the Oitero mill bobbed away from the bridge. It was drifting toward the open sea, caught in a current that was faster than an old man's tired limbs. If that pouch reached the mouth of the river, the evidence of Bento's crimes would be lost forever, buried in the Atlantic silt. Samuel didn't think. He dove. The water was a wall of ice that sucked the breath right out of his lungs. His fingers clawed at the surface, his eyes stinging from the brine. He could hear the shouting on the bank getting louder. Galdino, the overseer, had reached the bridge. The torchlight reflected off the water in jagged, angry streaks of orange. There, in the water! Galdino's voice was a jagged blade. "It's the old man! Shoot him!" A musket shot cracked through the night, the sound echoing off the stone arches of the bridge. A spray of water erupted just inches from Samuel's head. He ducked under the surface, his hand finally closing around the wet leather of the pouch. He gripped it with the strength of a man who has nothing left to lose. But the current was dragging him down, pulling him toward the deep channel where the predators waited. The problem was that the marsh was a maze, and Samuel was the rat. Every time he tried to surface for air, another shot rang out. Bento's men weren't just hunting a worker, they were trying to bury a witness. Samuel felt a sharp, searing pain in his shoulder. Not a direct hit, but a graze from a lead ball that felt like a brand of fire. He didn't scream, he couldn't afford the air. If you don't swallow this kind of well-dressed lie, subscribe and tell me, was this floating pouch a sign of hope or a death warrant? He managed to catch the low-hanging branch of a mangrove tree, his fingers trembling as he pulled himself into the thick, tangled roots. He was shivering so hard his teeth rattled, a sound that seemed loud as thunder in the sudden silence of the marsh. He pressed the pouch against his chest, feeling the hard shape of the ledger inside. It was still there, the double S mark on his belt dug into his skin, a constant reminder of the weight he was carrying. From his hiding spot, he could see the main house on the hill. It was glowing with 100 candles. While Samuel was bleeding in the mud, Bento was playing the part of the refined air. Music, the thin, elegant scrape of a violin, drifted down the slope, mocking the sound of the wind. Samuel looked at his hands. They were covered in black silt and his own blood. He felt a wave of cold, hard indignation. For 40 years he had built that house. He had polished the floors where the magistrate was now walking. He had carved the chairs where the killers were sitting. He wasn't just a carpenter. He was the ghost that built their world, and it was time for the ghost to speak. But the physical toll was starting to take hold. His vision swam. The wound on his shoulder was sluggishly pumping blood into his tunic. He needed to move, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. "Samuel," a voice whispered from the reeds behind him. He spun around, the iron branding tool raised like a club. It was Donna Zephyr. She was crouched in the mud, her fine silk apron ruined, her face a mask of grim determination. She held a small bundle in her hands, dry clothes and a heavy kitchen knife. "They're searching the lower path," she hissed, helping him up. "Galdino thinks you drowned. He's gone back to report to the master. But Bento is nervous. He's drinking too much, and the magistrate is asking questions. Magistrate Lemos isn't here for a party, Samuel. He's here because the merchant's family in Lisbon has been writing letters to the governor. They want to know why their father's business ended at the Oitairo mill." Samuel leaned on Zephyr, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "The ledger. It's all here, Zephyr. Every debt, every lie. And the merchant, Silver. He's under the bridge. The colonel wrote it down." Zephyr's eyes went wide. She had suspected, but hearing it made the air feel heavy. "Then you have to get to the house. Not the front door, they'll kill you before you reach the porch. Use the servants' tunnel, the one you built for the ice cellar. It leads directly to the library." Samuel nodded. He remembered the tunnel. He had designed it to stay cool, lining it with thick stone to keep the heat of the Bahia sun away from the master's wine. It was a dark, narrow passage, and it would be his only way in. But as they started to move toward the slope, a new sound cut through the violin music. It was the heavy, rhythmic trot of horses. A second carriage was arriving late to the gala, and this one bore the crest of the Imperial Guard. Bento hadn't just invited a magistrate, he had invited the law to witness his own coronation as the master of the valley. Or so he thought. The climb up the hill was a nightmare of shadows and pain. Every time a torch flared on the veranda above, Samuel and Zephyr had to drop into the tall grass, the smell of damp earth and rotting vegetation filling their senses. Samuel's mind was a blur of memories. The colonel's dying rattle, The look on Bento's face as he burned the papers, the weight of the ironwood beams. He realized something then, a thought that made his blood run colder than the river. The magistrate Lemos was a man of the law, yes, but he was also a man who liked gold. If Bento offered him enough of the stolen merchant's fortune, would the ledger even matter? Would a piece of paper signed by a dead man be enough to topple a living master? "I have to show him the seal," Samuel whispered to himself. The seal and the mark. They reached the hidden entrance to the ice cellar. It was overgrown with vines and blocked by a heavy wooden grate. Samuel reached for his pry bar, but his arm wouldn't obey. The blood loss was making him weak. "Let me," Zephyr said, grabbing the iron tool. She was a woman who had spent 40 years hauling heavy pots and kneading dough. She shoved the bar into the lock and heaved. The wood groaned, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. Inside, the tunnel was pitch black and smelled of damp stone and old wine. Samuel crawled forward, the leather pouch dragging in the dirt. Above him, he could hear the muffled sound of footsteps, the heavy boots of the guards, the light tap of dancing shoes, and the deep, booming voice of Bento, laughing at a joke that wasn't funny. He reached the end of the tunnel, where a small wooden trapdoor led up into the library. He could see a sliver of light through the cracks in the wood. He paused, his hand on the latch. In the room above, the music had stopped. A chair scraped against the floorboards. "I assure you, Magistrate," Bento's voice said, sounding closer than Samuel expected. "The merchant Silver left this plantation years ago. My father dealt with him personally. There are no records, because there was no debt." "Is that so?" A cold, precise voice replied. "Then perhaps you can explain why your father's personal seal was found on a bill of lading in the port of Salvador last month. A bill for goods that were never delivered?" Samuel felt the trapdoor vibrate. Someone was standing right on top of it. He gripped the iron branding tool, his knuckles white. He was 1 foot away from the men who held his fate in their hands, but he was still a ghost in the dark. And then he heard the sound of a drawer being pulled open, and the unmistakable click of a pistol being cocked. The click of the pistol was a small sound, but in the silence of the library, it sounded like a thunderclap. Samuel pressed his back against the cold stone of the tunnel, his heart hammering against his ribs. Above him, the floorboards groaned under the weight of a man pacing. He knew that heavy, uneven step. It was Bento. The man was a cornered animal, and a cornered animal with a gun is the most dangerous thing in the world. "You're making a mistake, Magistrate." Bento's voice was low, vibrating with a desperate kind of rage. "This is my house, my land. My father was a senile old fool who didn't know how to manage his affairs. Whatever papers you think you have, they're forgeries." "Forgeries?" Magistrate Lemos's voice was dry, like old parchment. "A man doesn't forge his own death, Bento, and he certainly doesn't forge a merchant's disappearance. I am not here to discuss your father's health. I am here to discuss the missing 3,000 contos de reis that Manuel Silva brought to this valley and never took out." Samuel felt a drop of sweat roll down his temple. He was shivering from the fever and the cold dampness of the tunnel, but he couldn't move. If he pushed the trapdoor now, he'd be staring down the barrel of Bento's weapon. He looked at the leather pouch in his lap. The truth was right there, inches away from the man who could do something about it, but the distance felt like 1,000 miles. The problem was that the law wasn't a shield for men like Samuel. It was a weapon for men like Lemos. If the magistrate realized that the only witness was a worker hiding in his cellar, would he see a victim or a nuisance? Samuel thought about the 40 years he had spent building this plantation. He thought about the knots in the wood he had smoothed over, the secrets he had kept for the old colonel. He realized that for his entire life he had been a part of the structure but never the owner. "The land doesn't belong to you, Bento," Samuel whispered to himself, the words a silent prayer in the dark. Suddenly, a heavy thud shook the floorboards. A glass shattered. "Put the gun down, Bento," Lemos said, his voice dropping an octave. "There are Imperial guards in your hallway. If a shot is fired in this room, you won't live to see the sunrise." "Then I'll take you with me," Bento hissed. This was the moment. The tension in the room above had reached its breaking point. Samuel knew that if he waited any longer, the truth would be buried under the bodies of the powerful. He didn't have the strength to lift the trapdoor with his wounded shoulder, so he used the only thing he had left, the iron branding tool. He wedged the double S mark into the gap of the trapdoor and heaved with everything he had. The wood splintered. The trapdoor flew open, hitting the underside of a heavy mahogany desk with a deafening crack. Samuel hauled himself up, his body covered in black mud, his tunic soaked in blood and river water. He looked like a nightmare rising from the earth. Bento spun around, the pistol shaking in his hand. The magistrate stepped back, his eyes wide with shock. "Who are you?" Lemos demanded, his hand reaching for the silver-headed cane on the desk. Samuel didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat was raw from the salt water. Instead, he reached into his tunic and pulled out the leather pouch. He slammed it onto the desk, right next to the magistrate's hand. Then he took the iron branding tool and placed it on top of the leather. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth and Bento's ragged breathing. Bento's face went from a flush of rage to a ghostly, sickly white. He recognized the pouch. He recognized the tool. He knew exactly what Samuel had brought back from the grave he had tried to burn. "He stole it!" Bento screamed, lunging forward. "The old man is a thief. He robbed my father's private study." But the magistrate wasn't looking at Bento. He was looking at the wax seal on the pouch. He picked up the branding iron, his fingers tracing the double S mark. He pressed the tool against the red wax. It was a perfect match. The mark of the colonel, used only for his most private and legal affairs. "This isn't a theft, Bento," Lemos said, his voice cold as the river. "This is an inventory." The magistrate pulled the ledger from the pouch. As he flipped the pages, his expression shifted from curiosity to a grim, calculating horror. He reached the page where the merchant Silver's name was written in the colonel's bold, shaking hand. "Wait," Lemos said, his eyes narrowing. "There's a map here, a location marked near the old stone bridge." Bento's hand, the one holding the pistol, began to tremble violently. He looked at Samuel, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a worker. He saw his own executioner. "You should have stayed in the fire," Bento whispered. But before he could pull the trigger, the library door burst open. Galdino, the overseer, rushed in, covered in soot and smelling of smoke. "Master, the shack is gone, but we found something in the ashes. There was a secret compartment, but it's empty." Galdino stopped mid-sentence as he saw Samuel standing in the middle of the room and the magistrate holding the very ledger they had been trying to burn. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 40 years of lies. But then Samuel found his voice. It was a low, rasping sound, like wood being sanded. "The merchant is under the bridge, magistrate," Samuel said, "and the debt is on that paper. My freedom was the price for my silence, but the colonel decided the truth was worth more." Lemos looked from the ledger to Bento, then to the imperial guards now pouring into the room. He slammed the ledger shut. "Take them both into custody, and bring the lanterns. We're going to the bridge." But as the guards moved to grab Bento, the master of the Oitero mill did something no one expected. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He turned the pistol toward the heavy cedar bookshelf and fired. The bullet hit a hidden catch, and a secret door, one even Samuel hadn't known about, swung open. Bento disappeared into the darkness of his own house, leaving his guests and his crimes behind. But the house was a maze Samuel had built, and he knew exactly where those stairs led. "He's going for the horses," Tiao's voice shouted from the hallway. Samuel didn't wait for the guards. He grabbed his carpentry mallet from his belt and plunged back into the darkness of the tunnel. He didn't need a map. He knew the skeleton of the Oitero mill better than he knew his own face. The problem was, Bento wasn't just running. He was heading for the one thing that could still save him, the original deed he had hidden in the rafters of the mill, the one piece of paper that could turn the whole valley into a battlefield. Samuel crawled through the narrow service shaft, his fingers finding the familiar grooves of the joints he'd fitted 20 years ago. The Oitero mill was a beast of wood and iron, and right now its heart was cold. He could hear Bento's frantic boots pounding on the catwalks above. Bento was screaming for Galdino, but Galdino was already in chains. The master was alone in the very machine that had made his family's fortune, and he was terrified. The problem was Bento didn't understand the mill. He saw it as a source of money. Samuel saw it as a living thing. As Samuel emerged into the rafters, The moon cut through the high windows, casting long skeletal shadows across the massive grinding gears. Bento was there, clutching a small iron cylinder he'd pulled from a hollowed-out beam. The real deed. The one that proved the land had been signed over to the Crown decades ago to pay for his grandfather's gambling debts. "Stay back, old man!" Bento shrieked, waving the cylinder like a weapon. "This is mine! Everything you see is mine!" Samuel didn't stop. He walked across the narrow beam with the balance of a man who had spent his life on scaffolding. He felt a strange, cold calm. He wasn't a worker anymore. He was the foreman of Bento's judgment. And then the mill groaned. The wind caught the exterior sails, and the massive wooden gears began to turn, slowly at first, then with a bone-crushing momentum. Bento stumbled, his foot catching in the widening gap of the main drive wheel. The paper cylinder slipped from his hand, tumbling into the dark depths of the machinery. "The mill doesn't recognize you, Bento," Samuel said, his voice steady and dry. "It only knows the hand that built it." But as Bento reached into the spinning gears to save his paper, a shadow moved in the corner. Someone else was in the mill, and they weren't there to help. The shadow in the corner was young Tiao. The boy moved like a cat, snatching the iron cylinder a heartbeat before the massive gears could crush it into dust. Bento, driven by a frantic madness, lunged after him, his fingers clawing at the air, but the mill didn't recognize its master. The wooden teeth caught his fine silk sleeve, then the flesh beneath. His scream was a raw, jagged sound that was quickly swallowed by the rhythmic thunder of the grinding stones. By the time Magistrate Lemos and the guards reached the rafters, the man who believed he owned the valley was a mangled wreck, pinned by the very machinery that had built his family's empire. The merchant's bones were recovered from beneath the bridge that same morning, exactly where the colonel's ledger said they would be. Bento was dragged away in iron shackles, his name and his pride stripped away. Samuel watched the sunrise from the veranda of the main house. He wasn't a worker anymore. He was a free man with a pension and a deed of his own. The double S brand was no longer a symbol of oppression, but the mark of a truth that couldn't be burned. Subscribe. Here we pull up what they tried to bury. And comment, do you think the colonel truly cared for Samuel, or was this just his final way to punish a son he hated? A man can hide a body, but he can never hide the debt it leaves behind. Greed blinded the son, and the dirt he thought was worthless became the proof that buried him.